I wasn't looking for Belmore. That's how it works. You don't mark it on a route. It finds you when your signal dies, when the air goes flat, when the hills hold their breath. 20 miles out from my target, Coolidge, a busted mining town with records I'd already pulled, I missed a turn that didn't exist yesterday. The pines pressed inward until they were one long rib cage. Then the trees parted like curtains and Main Street opened under my headlights. Storefront windows like dry eyes, signs slanting, letters washed to ghosts. The town sat cupped in a shallow valley, hills rising around it like walls built to keep sound from escaping. I coasted my rental to a stop and killed the engine. Silence snapped shut. Not rural quiet, the kind with crickets and wind in the eaves and distant highway hiss, but absence. A lidded jar of air. Even my door's latch sounded wrong when I stepped out, too present, too loud. I stood in the middle of the street with my camera bag and tried out a human sound. Hello. The word didn't travel. It struck the buildings and died. No echo, just a soft refusal. I'm an urban explorer by trade and compulsion. The blog is called Forgotten Spaces, schools with calendars still pinned to 1998, mills that smell like damp rope and iron filings, hospitals where the light tastes like bleach. I document what's vanishing and try to post before it's all gone or paved into something bland. Places like this usually rust and crumble audibly, window tin tapping, a hinge complaining, a sparrow copying the squeal. Not here. Here, the weeds in the sidewalk cracks looked like paper pressed into stone. Color had leached out of everything. The architecture wore the 1910s kindly. Carved window trim, a barber pole with the red and blue turned to chalk, a general store with a stubborn display of tins and thread behind glass filmed with decades. I took photographs and felt like I was stealing the last outlines of letters. At the end of the street, a building shouldered above the rest. 3 stories of brick and stone and certainty, with a broad staircase and doors like ship's timbers. The lintel carved itself into my mind as if I'd read it before I could focus. Grand Belmore Hotel. You get a sense for buildings if you walk into enough dead ones. Some are hives with the bees gone. Some are throats that still swallow. The Grand Belmore felt attentive, not warm, not welcoming, attentive. The doors were heavy, and they knew I was there. One gave with a long hinge groan that rolled up into the lobby's high ceiling and seemed to hang there on a thread. I let my eyes adjust. Marble columns, crown moldings that had once been painted with patience, crystal chandeliers, each prism furred by cobweb, each bulb a pearly blister. A curved front desk of dark wood, brass footrail dulled by decades. The carpet had been red and was now a diagram of traffic patterns worn to thread. Everything wore dust like a winter coat, except one thing. In the far corner, a grand piano stood black as a still lake at night, polished. Not a fingerprint on it. The keys were a line of clean teeth. The brass pedals winked as if they'd learned the light source by heart. The wrongness of it stung. A single object tended in a world where all other hands had left. I reached, because reaching is how you say you're not afraid. My fingertip pressed one white key. The note rose pure and hung there too long. It didn't travel so much as fill the room, as if the sound had no distance to cross, only space to take. For a heartbeat, it was everywhere at once. Then the air closed again like a mouth and swallowed it. Weird acoustics, I told nothing. Behind the desk, a ledger lay open, leather gone soft at the corners from 100 years of elbows. I photographed it as it lay and then leaned in. October 15th, 1927. Names and room numbers in steady ink. The last hand had lifted mid-stroke. Up the grand stairs, the carpet was a worn strip down the center. The banister smooth where it had taught so many palms the curve. I'm the one always telling readers to test each tread, to respect old wood. I tested each tread. They complained without threat. The sounds old houses make when they remember bodies. The second-floor hallway ran both ways under wallpaper peeling in slow scrolls. Door after door resisted my curiosity. Locked, locked, locked. Abandoned hotels are rarely tidy. Teenagers and shelter seekers in storms pry their way in. Not here. Here, everything had agreed to keep its mouth shut. I accept the last door on the left. It sat ajar the width of 2 fingers as if someone had just leaned out to hear the weather. I announce myself, because you do that when you want the world to act normal. Hello. The voice that answered was nothing. I pushed the door. The hinges didn't make a sound. Inside, time had stopped with intention. Not modern perfect. Period perfect. Bed made tight, the crisp of old linen palpable even in the dim. Writing desk arranged in a geometry of pens and paper. Curtains drawn, boards crossed behind them to keep the day from entering. No dust. No cobweb strand catching the light of my flashlight. And the man in the armchair. He faced the boarded window, hands placed formally on the arms, shoes polished to a muted glow. Tuxedo fitted like a promise kept. The body inside the suit had gone long past language. Skin drawn to leather, eye sockets emptied to dark coins. The mouth had fallen open into a long last syllable. The tuxedo looked pressed that morning. I have learned the difference between shock and noise. I did not scream. I named what I was looking at to myself, a long dead man, preserved by the room, sitting like he'd paused before standing, and beside him on a small table, unreal as a joke told solemnly, a red rose. Fresh. The petals were glassy with droplets, as if someone had lifted a spray bottle 10 minutes ago and misted love back onto it. I raised my camera because documentation is a kind of prayer. The flash made its own weather in that perfect room. I took the angles I would need to prove that I had seen what I had seen. The dead man's face, the rose catching the light, the bedscarf's fringe, the unfaded ink on hotel stationery. I backed into the hallway and placed the door where I'd found it, 2 fingers wide. My heart was a shoe in a dryer. I turned toward the stairs. Music drifted up the well, not random keys, a melody, not a beginner's left-right plod. Fingers with a history, jazz maybe, something from smoke and soft laughter. My hand found the banister. I went down. Halfway, I could see the curve of the desk, the ledger still open, the chandeliers waiting to fail. The piano tucked out of sight. The melody climbed and then broke into a flourish that felt like a door swinging wide. A step groaned under my weight, louder than the others. A sound with opinion. The piano stopped mid-note. The silence that followed had a shape. It leaned. Then the melody picked up at the exact point it had broken. Like whoever was playing had paused to listen to my weight and decided I was safe to ignore. Whoever. Except no one sat on the bench. I reached the floor and turned. The keys moved under no hands, white and black, falling and lifting in choreography. The music wasn't mechanical. It breathed and hesitated and leaned into its own sweetness, the way a player does when they know who's listening. I stood calf to marble, my camera hanging at my hip like a tool I'd forgotten the use for. The air changed. Not colder, not warmer, densified as if the room inhaled. The chandeliers lit. Not the bulbs as they were, but as they had been. The carpet ripened back into red with gold threads that flowed when you moved your eyes. The dust that had owned everything drew back like a tide. People stood where absence had been. A woman in silver fringe laughed, and the dress made a soft rainfall sound. A man in a tuxedo that taught you what the word meant lifted a glass to someone only he could see. Perfume and cigarette smoke braided with a sweet note of spilled champagne and warm varnish. The lobby unshrouded itself into a night that had been waiting exactly this long for the cue. First time at the Grand Belmore, sir? The bartender's white jacket held a pressed crease like a blade. He polished a glass that did not need it. I made a sound and then tried again. What is happening? The autumn gala, he said, as if I'd asked for the time. Biggest night of the season. I moved backward until the first stair found my heel. Through the viewfinder, everything was still real. I lowered the camera. Sometimes a lens is a mercy. Sometimes it is just another eye to watch you fail to understand. You should try the champagne. He spares no expense. The voice came from behind me. Familiar because I had seen it emptied. I turned. Jeffrey Romero looked exactly as a man looks when his name has not yet become a bolded line in a list of the dead. Strong jaw. Eyes that warmed when they found the wife approaching from the crowd. He had the tuxedo I had already met. He had his hand around a glass and the room around his name. I asked who William was. I don't know why. The brain does its own triage under stress. He laughed and corrected me gently. I am. Jeffrey, this is my hotel. His wife Beverly slipped into the space at his side like a missing color. Her smile found mine for a second and then dimmed. You shouldn't be here, she told me, quietly enough that it could have been my own thought shaped into sound. Jeffrey raised his glass to me anyway, to new friends. My bones rejected the invitation like a graft. I ran. The doors gave way to night that felt honest. My car had never looked more alive. I drove until the hills were behind me and a gas station sign through the highway, a small blue Mercy. Promise, I told myself as I pulled in. I'm going to learn what happened here, and I'm going to learn how not to go back. The gas station was a square of fluorescent certainty on an otherwise empty map. The bell over the door made a sound that announced life. An older guy behind the counter paged through a magazine without pretending he wasn't watching me. Bathroom? I said. Back left. Keys there. In the mirror, I looked like someone who had stepped out of a photograph in the wrong decade. Too pale. Eyes blown out. I sluiced cold water over my face and held onto the sink until the world stopped tilting toward 1927. Back at the counter, the name tag read, Atlas. You okay? He asked, eyes on my hands. You look like you've seen a ghost. Something like that. He set the magazine aside. Where'd you come from? Belmore, and tested him. He didn't blink. People don't find Belmore, he said. It finds them. It's not on any map. That's the point. He tapped an invisible spot on the counter, the way you mark a trail for yourself when you don't want anybody else to see it. Used to be a mining town. Gold enough to make men ruin good marriages. Then one night, took it all. October 15th, 1927. Fire at the Grand Belmore, gala night, over 100 dead. I told him I'd been inside. Told him about the self-playing piano, the lobby waking up around me, the bartender who knew my future, and the owner who didn't. Told him about the room upstairs, the man in the chair in a tuxedo that remembered every press of a hot iron. Jeffrey Romero, Atlas said, like a man supplying a last name to a photograph. Owner. Found him sitting like that after. Some say he lit the match. Insurance money for a hotel he couldn't carry. I told him I'd met Romero downstairs alive. Atlas shrugged a little, like we were talking weather. Happens. The hotel's stuck on that night. They think they're still living it. The ones who see you, sometimes they don't. Sometimes you're just furniture. I scrolled through my camera to prove both versions could be true at once. The empty lobby, the ledger, the dead owner. Then the shots I'd taken when the room filled and the band swung. Black frames, pure absence, like I'd shot the dark itself. Atlas nodded as if this, too, was expected. It doesn't like to be photographed, not from the outside, not when you're inside it. Has anyone else been there? I asked. Last one I remember was a kid with a good camera and bad judgment. Ezra Ramirez. Posted some shots, said he was going back for more. Didn't show again. Sheriff calls it missing. I call it Belmore. A chill like a draft ran through me. You think he's still there? I think that place hooks people like fish. Some shake free. Some don't. I told him about the rose, how something in that room refused the clock. Beverly wore one every night, he said. Gentle like he was setting down a loaded thing. Folks leave them for her. Skylar, distant kin, comes by once a year. Quick. Daylight. In and out. Don't go back, he added, not as a warning, but as a fact he wanted to hear me repeat. I drove away with my hands too tight on the wheel and a new weight in the passenger seat where my bag sat. In the motel that night, the bedspread's geometry crinkled like paper under my thigh when I sat. I took the ritual photos explorer brains require, proofs and timestamps. Dusty lobby, ledger, room with the four-poster, Jeffrey Romero's face the color of old varnish. Then the black squares where the party should have been. On the laptop, the blackness stayed black. I searched what could be searched. Tragedy at the Grand Belmore. A digitized newspaper with a headline large enough to shout. 103 lives. Basement origin. Accelerants. Words that hear themselves echoed for generations grow hard edges. Follow-ups. Suspicion. A too convenient policy signed months earlier, a memorial list. Romero Jeffrey, Romero Beverly, Simmons Wayne. The bartender. I remembered the white jacket and the steady hands and felt my stomach find a lower floor. I posted nothing. I wrote a clean blog entry a month later that caged the facts and left out the blood. The comments asked for more. I answered none. In my apartment, the weeks folded into a long gray line, interrupted by the sound of a piano I could not find, and the smell of champagne that no one else could smell. I woke at 3, some nights, sure a crowd had just gone silent to hear the next note fall. I started leaving lights on like lighthouses leave their beams, because something should be warned away, even if it is you. Then an email found me. Subject line about your visit to Belmore. Sender. Skylar Romero. I nearly closed the laptop out of spite. I opened it because curiosity is love dressed as a bad habit. Dear Mr. Burns, thank you for the photographs. Jeffrey was my great uncle. Our family has so few images that aren't singed by rumor. The story that he set the fire has never sat right with us. My grandmother swore he wasn't a man who would burn his own dream. She wrote clear and steady, the kind of person who knows how to set a table and a paragraph. She thanked me for the ledger image and the lobby, and for inadvertently catching the angle of a chandelier her grandmother used to describe. Then she asked the question I'd left out on purpose. Did you experience anything unusual? I phoned her because some things need voices. She listened while I laid the night down in order. The town that wasn't there until it was, the piano that didn't need hands, the lobby blooming, Jeffrey greeting me with a glass while his body sat upstairs with a fresh rose for company. She didn't interrupt. When she did speak, it was to stitch my account to others she'd collected like a careful archivist. A salesman in 1938 who wrote about a gala in a town his map didn't know and then stopped mid-sentence forever. A handful of wanderers who came back changed in ways their families could taste but not name. Ezra Ramirez, of course. A last post. A silence. Do the sounds fade, she asked finally. Sometimes, then not at all, then a little. They come back. Anniversaries have gravity, she said, especially when fire is involved. I promised aloud to a woman I had never met that I would not go back. The phone made the vow real. The year turned like a coin, and October came heavy. I duct-taped my apartment door from the inside and shoved furniture against it. I froze my keys into a bowl of water and went to sleep to the hum of my refrigerator. None of it mattered. At 2:17 a.m., I woke holding a steering wheel, highway unwinding under my headlights, radio set to an old station that didn't exist where I live, camera in the passenger seat, boots laced, jeans and flannel. The body had risen and dressed and begun. I pulled onto the shoulder and breathed until the night settled. The map app pulsed blue toward a place I had not told it about. I turned the car around and drove until a rest stop offered me lights and concrete and coffee with a bendy flap for a lid. On the camera, the same sequence of black frames, except this time, in one, something had developed like a bruise after a knock, a faint image of people under light, me among them, Jeffrey's arm around my shoulders, both of us smiling at the person I used to be. I called Skylar. Stay where you are, she said. Don't go toward it. Don't go home. I'm staying on the phone until the sky goes lighter than the road. We talked about real things until they felt real again. Her grandmother's insistence that Jeffrey wasn't a burner of his own house. My habit of cataloging handrails and door hardware by the second. The sound a chandelier makes when it finally gives up and falls. When the first smear of blue bled into the east, the tightness in my chest loosened. It's passing, I said, surprised to hear that I believed it. Go home, she told me. Sleep. It's over for another year. For months afterwards, sleep was a door I knocked on and ran from. Then the rhythm of ordinary life came back and wore me down to normal. I kept my promises, daylight only, no tragedies on purpose, leave a plan, tell someone where your bones are heading. A small calm settled. I mistook it for peace. 10 years later, on a bright October morning that pretended it was spring, a parcel waited in my mailbox. Brown paper, neat block letters that looked like someone had practiced. No return address. The postmark said a word the internet denies: Belmore. Inside, a jewelry box bedded with dried rose petals. On the petals, a brass key with a heavy fob. Engraving softened by touch but still legible. Room 237. I had stood in that room. I had photographed the dead man wearing that number like a badge. I felt the key's warmth in my palm and didn't realize until later that it had no business being warm. I called Skylar and left a message. She called back before I could pace a groove into the porch. "Burn it," she said. "Then scatter the metal where water won't remember it. Why now? Anniversaries stack. Decades make doors. And if Emma is sensitive..." She didn't have to finish. My daughter had hummed that piano melody at 4 years old, coloring at the kitchen table, unaware she was singing my fear. She had hummed it at 7 and 8, shrugging when I asked where she'd heard it. I built a small fire in a bucket in the yard, because sometimes you need small rituals that work. The dried petals flared obediently. The brass took longer, slumped, and surrendered. When the ash cooled, I carried it to the river and fed the current until the last glitter was gone. That night, the house slept like a chest, finally empty of a weight. Emma didn't hum in her sleep. I stood in the doorways and counted breaths. The keys sat where I could see them. Years later, Skylar asked me to meet her at the State Historical Society, marble and hush, and the kind of reading room that teaches you to turn pages with reverence. She had boxes, folders, names tagged with years. "I donated the collection," she said, "but I need you to see why." She laid out survivor accounts from the fire, 20 souls who had stepped outside to smoke or breathe or weep at midnight and survived because of it. In their statements were small, sharp notes that cut through time. A man at the party holding a strange black box to his eye. Another guest mentioning a confused fellow in an odd blue jacket. A bartender sent to the cellar who'd glimpsed a man whose hand glowed with a small rectangle of light. I flipped to a photograph labeled for the gala, October 15th, 1927. Water damaged, edges frayed, but the room was unmistakable. At the image's left edge, nearly cut off, a figure in clothing that hadn't been invented yet. The jacket line, the shoes, the restless posture of someone from the future staring into a past he had no language for. Skylar watched me find myself with my mouth closed. Her voice was quiet. "I don't think Belmore is only a haunting. I think the hotel exists sideways to time. When you're there, then and now. That's why your photos of the party are black. You can't photograph the room you're already standing inside." I thought about Jeffrey's easy greeting and Beverly's warning shaped like mercy, about the way Wayne's bar towel folded the same square forever, about how some people go back, about how some never come back at all because they never leave. "Researchers want in," she said. "Equipment, controls, theories with Latin names. They want you to guide them." "No." She nodded, not disappointed so much as relieved to have someone tell her what she might already believe. We packed the boxes. We slid the past into labeled acid-free sleeves designed to outlast our hands by a century. "Do you ever wonder why you?" she asked at the door. "I think Belmore is a hunter that knows what kind of footsteps to follow," I said. "Wrong turn, right time." 20 years after my first mistake, I found myself braking in front of a gas station that had been upgraded into bright aisles and coffee that didn't taste like rainwater. The young man behind the counter had Atlas's eyes. He told me his uncle had passed during a Broncos game. Fast, clean, the way a good man deserves to go if he can't grow very old. He had a journal. Atlas's handwriting marched through it, date after date, small, neat lines of other people's fear. My name was there, and a note in a different ink. Called 6 months later, still having dreams. Talked him down. Ezra Ramirez had an entry too, and in a plastic case, the SD card the sheriff hadn't wanted. On my phone, his black frames gave way twice. The hotel exterior lit like a ship. Then the lobby, full. The fringe of a dress caught mid-swing, Jeffrey's hand lifted, Ezra playing the piano while a ring of guests leaned in, smiling as if the night had decided it would choose them to be safe forever. In the last shot, Ezra stood on the grand stairs with Beverly's arm threaded through his, the burn already beginning in the background like dawn in the wrong place. Some people find what they were looking for in Belmore, Frank told me. Uncle Atlas said, you were one of the lucky ones who remembered to run. I drove to the hill where the town sometimes is. The fields were only fields, gold and clean under a wind with new edges. I stood at the road's lip and said the hotel's name quietly, like saying it wrong could make it right again. For a moment, the breeze learned a melody and forgot it. That was all. I went home to the life I had built instead of the life that had almost claimed me. Important points remain, and they do not argue with each other. The hotel is a loop in a place where the ground is thin. Some doors do not close from your side. Sometimes memory is the most dangerous invitation. Sometimes the mercy is in burning the key. I still keep the Belmore folder on a separate drive. The empty lobby, Romero in his chair, the ledger stopped mid-name. The black frames that refuse to show me a room I don't belong in anymore. Every October 15th, I wake with champagne in my nose and the feeling that someone is about to lift a glass to me. I stay close. I keep the keys where I can see them. I make pancakes. And when my daughter hums something she calls nothing, I hum back a new tune, louder, in the bright kitchen where morning sun warms the tile. The party keeps its own time without us. Let it. I woke before dawn, the van's windows fogged from my breath. The fog outside clung thick against the windshield, smearing the edges of the lighthouse like it was still forming itself. The beam wasn't sweeping, it pointed inland, fixed and unwavering, cutting through the mist and the tree line beyond. Something about it made me uneasy. Not afraid exactly, just unsettled. The same feeling you get when you realize the quiet isn't natural, like the silence has purpose. I stepped out into the damp cold, stretching my legs, and felt the ground sponge under my boots. The fog rolled in with every exhale, heavier the closer I got to the edge of the bluff. That's when I saw footprints, bare ones, leading from the rocks up toward the lighthouse door. They weren't mine. They weren't from any hiker either. The toes were wide, almost human, but longer, the impressions deep as if the person had been carrying something heavy. They disappeared halfway up the path where the gravel turned to grass. I tried to follow, but the prints vanished like they'd been erased by the mist itself. The lighthouse door was slightly open. I called out, "Hello? Ranger service? Anyone up there?" But only my voice answered back, dull and muffled. The salt air thickened the sound, swallowing it before it could carry far. I pushed the door open. Inside smelled of brine and cold iron, the kind that coats your tongue. The air was still except for the slow, rhythmic groan of metal above. The rotation mechanism, I guessed, though the light wasn't turning. Dust coated the staircase, spiraling upward, and a rope dangled from the top like a loose thread, waiting to be pulled. There were papers on a small desk near the entrance, yellowed log sheets filled in with cramped handwriting. The dates stopped about 5 years ago. The last entry read, March 17, 2:14 a.m., beam repositioned to sector 45 degrees inland. Movement confirmed. Movement confirmed? I ran my finger along the page, half expecting the ink to smear, but it was dry. I flipped through the rest, weather reports, supply tallies, notes about erosion. Then one page halfway through had been torn out clean, like someone didn't want it read. I heard footsteps above me, slow, deliberate, echoing down the spiral metal stairs. "Hello?" I called again, louder this time. "I'm just passing through. Didn't mean to intrude." No reply. The footsteps stopped. I climbed slowly, hand brushing the rusted railing, each step shrieking under my weight. When I reached the lantern room, the air was colder. The glass panes around the room were fogged from within, condensation beating like sweat. The massive Fresnel lens loomed in the center, motionless, light still burning, but steady, aimed through a small gap between the trees inland. And someone had scratched a line across the metal base of the lens. "Don't let it turn back." I turned toward the sound of breathing. There was a man standing by the window, his face lit in half by the reflection of the beam. He wore an old weathered coat and heavy rubber boots, but his skin looked thin, almost translucent under the light. "You're not supposed to be here," he said, voice rough, like it hadn't been used in years. "I didn't mean to trespass," I replied, raising my hands slightly. "I thought this place was abandoned." He didn't move closer. "It isn't." I hesitated, then said, "You the keeper?" A pause. "Was. Still am, when it matters." The light behind him pulsed faintly, dimming for just a moment, and I caught the reflection of something moving between the trees where the beam pointed, a shape too large to be a person, crawling low to the ground. "What's that out there?" I asked, stepping toward the window. He moved faster than I expected, blocking my view. "You don't look inland," he said sharply. "Not when the light's awake." "What do you mean awake?" He stared past me, eyes clouded like someone remembering a dream. "It calls things, old things. The sea isn't where they live, it's just where they hide. When the light goes inland, it keeps them from crossing." I tried to laugh, thinking maybe he was just eccentric, one of those locals who lived off-grid too long. "You're saying the light's protecting the land from something in the trees?" He didn't answer. Instead, he walked to the base of the lens, checking the mechanism like a man tending to a wound. "It hasn't turned back in 5 years," he murmured, "and it can't. The fog listens. The fog remembers." He turned to me again. "You should leave before nightfall. It's been thick these last few days." "What happens if the fog gets thicker?" I asked. His gaze flicked toward the trees. "Then it won't matter what side you're on." I left the lighthouse with that line still echoing in my head. Back at the van, I made coffee, trying to shake off the chill, but I couldn't stop glancing toward the forest where the light cut through the mist. It stayed steady all day, unmoving, as if frozen in mid-command. Around noon, I walked a mile inland, hoping to find where the beam landed. The ground turned soft and then mucky, dark with moisture, even though the air was dry. The forest was strange, quiet in the wrong way. No birds, no insects, just the distant hum of the beam. I could actually hear it, like a vibration in the air. My chest felt tight the deeper I went. When I reached the spot, the beam struck the ground like a spotlight, and the earth was black there, not burned, but damp and sunken, a small crater maybe 10 feet wide. The center was moving, breathing, like water under a skin of dirt. Then I saw it, a hand pressed up from beneath the soil, pale and bloated, fingers stretching before sinking back under. The ground closed over it like a mouth swallowing something it didn't want seen. I stumbled back, my breath catching, heart pounding in my throat. I waited, half expecting it to resurface, but it didn't. Only the beam stayed fixed, steady as ever, right on that spot. I don't know how long I stood there before heading back. The air around the trees seemed to thicken, whispering like wet cloth rubbing together. When I reached my van again, the lighthouse keeper was standing by the road. He looked smaller in daylight, older, his eyes hollow. "Did you see it?" he asked quietly. I didn't answer. He nodded, almost to himself. "Then you understand why it can't stop. The ocean gives back what it takes if you turn the light away. You think it's warning ships?" He laughed, a soft, broken sound. "No, it's warning us." He started walking back toward the tower. The fog rolled in behind him, thicker now, curling like fingers around his coat. I thought about packing up right then, about leaving before night, but something in me hesitated. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe fear pretending to be curiosity. Either way, I stayed. That night, when the fog pressed against the van windows like cold hands, I saw the beam flicker once, just once, and for a moment, something vast and shining moved between the trees where the light failed to reach. And I realized what the keeper meant when he said the light was the only thing keeping them from crossing. That night, I couldn't sleep. The fog didn't move the way normal fog should. It pulsed like it was breathing. Every time I turned over in bed, I could see the faint glow of the beam through the cracks in the curtains, slicing inland toward the woods. I told myself I'd leave in the morning, head south along the coast, maybe never mention this place to anyone. But sometime after midnight, I heard a low hum. It started like the wind through glass, then built into a deep vibration, one I could feel in my ribs. My coffee mug rattled against the table. The beam flickered again, twice this time, and when it steadied, there were shapes moving through the fog, tall and slow, like the silhouettes of people walking without direction. I turned off every light in the van and pressed against the window. The fog outside was lit faintly by the lighthouse, and I swear I saw one of those shapes stop and face me. It didn't have a face at first, just a hollow outline, but then it made one, pressing a suggestion of features into the fog itself as if it were learning. That was enough. I slid into the driver's seat and turned the ignition. The engine coughed, sputtered, and died. The battery light blinked red once before everything went dark. For a long moment, I just sat there, the hum growing louder. Then came the knock, 3 slow taps against the van door. I didn't move. The second knock was harder, followed by a dragging sound across the metal, like fingertips tracing the outline of the door handle. I thought of the footprints that had vanished on the path. When the handle began to twitch, I whispered, "No, no, no," under my breath, praying the lock held. And it did, until the third knock. It wasn't a hit this time. It was a vibration, like the metal itself had been struck by sound. The door flexed, just slightly, enough to make me recoil. Then everything went silent again. I don't remember falling asleep. I just remember waking up to the sound of gulls and the smell of burning salt. The beam was still on, cutting through the thinning fog, but something had changed. The angle was wrong. It was pointing more inland now, slightly to the left, and halfway down the bluff the grass was blackened, smoke rising from the soil in a narrow line leading toward the woods. I stepped outside, every nerve in my body screaming not to. The air tasted like metal. The lighthouse keeper was nowhere to be seen. The path to the tower was lined with dead gulls, their feathers soaked in gray, as if they'd drowned mid-flight. I forced myself to look away, climbing the steps 2 at a time until I reached the door. It was wide open. Inside, the papers I'd seen before were scattered across the floor. A few pages were damp. Footprints pressed into them. Bare, human-looking, but each toe longer than it should have been, curling slightly like claws. At the top of the staircase, I found the keeper. He was standing perfectly still beside the lens, staring at it as if hypnotized. The light wasn't white anymore. It was gold, burning so bright I could see the veins in his face. "Hey," I said carefully, "what happened to the light?" He didn't blink. "It's moving again," he said in a hollow voice. "They want it turned back." "Who?" "The ones that walked before the tide." His eyes rolled toward me, and I saw tears, or maybe seawater, running down his cheeks. They're whispering through the fog. They think I've forgotten the oath. I tried to step closer, but he raised a trembling hand. "Don't come near it," he rasped. "It remembers faces. It marks them." His arm dropped, and I saw the burn on his wrist, a pattern that looked like concentric rings, as if something had branded him from the inside. "I can help you," I said. "We can turn it off, or call someone." "No one comes here after dark." He smiled faintly. "You already know that." He turned back to the lens, touching it like a priest blessing an altar. "The fog comes from the trees now," he murmured. "That means they're almost through." I didn't understand any of it, but my instincts screamed at me to leave. When I got back to the van, I found the driver's door open. I know I had locked it. Inside on the dashboard was one of the keeper's old log pages, folded, damp, and smelling like brine. The handwriting was shaky this time. March 18, 3:40 a.m., beam disrupted, entity approaching from inland. The sea is inside the forest now. I spent the rest of the day trying to get the van to start. The battery was fine, the wiring intact, but the key wouldn't turn. It was like something was holding the mechanism still from inside. By evening, the fog rolled in again, thick and restless. That's when I heard singing. A woman's voice, far away but clear, carried by the fog. The melody was old, sad, maybe even familiar, but the words were indistinct, drawn out like they'd been underwater too long. It came from the woods. Against every instinct I had, I grabbed my flashlight and followed. The beam from the lighthouse sliced across the fog to my right, and each time it passed, the singing grew louder. I told myself I'd just go a few hundred feet, just enough to see if someone needed help. The forest swallowed the sound of my footsteps. The air was thick with the smell of algae and rot, like seaweed left to dry on rocks. Then I saw her. She was standing in the beam's glow, barefoot, her dress soaked and clinging to her skin. Her hair was long and tangled with bits of kelp, and when she turned toward me, her eyes were pale, filmed over like she'd drowned. "You shouldn't be here," she said softly. I froze. "Who are you?" Her mouth twitched into something like a smile. The ones who walk aren't allowed to speak their names anymore. "What do you mean?" She tilted her head, listening to something behind me. "The keeper failed," she whispered. "Now it has to find another." The light swept past again, and for a fraction of a second, her shadow split. One part of it stayed attached to her. The other kept moving, crawling across the ground toward me. I stumbled backward, tripping on a root, and the flashlight flew from my hand. The beam hit her feet and went right through. She didn't move closer. She only said, "When the light turns back to the sea, run." Then she was gone. The forest went dark, except for the faint pulse of gold through the trees. I ran. Back at the van, I saw the lighthouse beam twitch once more, then begin to rotate, slowly, painfully, toward the ocean. I could see the lens stutter against its gears, the whole tower groaning, and through the fog, from the direction of the forest, came the sound of something enormous moving, branches breaking, the earth itself straining under weight. The singing returned, louder now, but it wasn't one voice anymore. It was dozens, hundreds, all merging together into something that wasn't quite human anymore. I watched the light finish its turn, its golden beam sliding over the ocean. The fog recoiled as if burned. Then, beneath the sound of the sea, I heard the keeper scream. I ran back toward the lighthouse without thinking, boots slipping on the wet grass, the fog clawing at my face. Every breath felt like inhaling seawater. The scream hadn't been short or sharp. It had dragged, like someone being pulled through something they didn't want to see. The door to the tower was wide open, the light spilling down the stairs in fractured ribbons. Inside, the air felt charged, almost electric. I called out for the keeper, but my voice came out hoarse, barely audible over the low moan of the mechanism grinding against itself. When I reached the lantern room, the light had stopped rotating. It was stuck halfway, half aimed inland, half toward the sea. The keeper was on the floor. He was still breathing, but shallowly, his chest rising and falling in short bursts. His eyes were open, fixed on the ceiling, pupils dilated wide enough to swallow the color. The burn on his wrist had spread, branching up his arm in dark veins like ink in water. Hey, stay with me," I said, kneeling beside him. He blinked, slow, mechanical. Then his lips moved. "Don't let it turn back." "It already did," I said. "It's facing the ocean now." His head twitched, an almost imperceptible shake. "Then it's too late." I followed his gaze up to the lens. The glass looked wrong, fractured from the inside, hairline cracks spidering across its surface. Each one glowed faintly, like veins of molten gold, and inside those cracks, something was moving. Not liquid, not air. Something else, something alive. The lens pulsed once, the whole tower seemed to breathe with it. Then the fog outside shifted. I looked through the window just as a wave of mist rolled inland faster than wind should carry it. And in that fog, I saw them, the same tall silhouettes I'd seen earlier, moving as one, silent and slow. But this time, they weren't made of vapor. They had weight, form. The trees bent under their passage. I backed away from the window. "What are they?" I asked, barely able to speak. The keeper turned his head, his voice thin as thread. "Things the sea forgot to bury." The ground shook then, not violently, but enough to rattle the glass and send dust from the rafters. The light flared in response, a desperate burst before dimming to a pale yellow, and beneath it all I heard the sound of waves crashing, except we were miles from the beach. "Listen to me," the keeper said suddenly, grabbing my wrist with surprising strength. "If it goes out, they'll take everything with a pulse. It doesn't matter if you're on land or in the water. The fog doesn't care." I stared down at him. "Then how do I keep it on?" He smiled faintly, teeth gray under the golden light. You don't. You feed it. Before I could ask what he meant, the tower's door below slammed shut on its own. The sound reverberated through the stairs like a gunshot. The light flickered again, weaker this time, and through the fog below I could see those figures gathering at the base of the cliff. Their heads tilted back toward the tower, faces indistinct but aware. Then one of them began to climb. I rushed to the edge of the balcony and aimed my flashlight down. The beam caught movement, limbs that weren't arranged right, too long, joints bending both ways. The thing moved like water flowing uphill, its body a silhouette of dripping fog and black flesh that glistened as it rose. The keeper groaned behind me. They always find the keeper first. I spun around. Then tell me how to stop them. He reached into his coat with trembling hands and pulled out a small tin box, rusted and dented. The light remembers its own fire, he whispered. Take it. I hesitated before grabbing it. Inside were matches, old, water-stained, but beneath them, wrapped in oilcloth, was something else, a shard of glass, maybe from the lens itself. It was faintly warm. What do I do with this? He didn't answer. His body had gone still, his hands still clutching the edge of the light. Below, the sound of climbing stopped. Then came the creak of the lower door opening again. I heard wet footsteps on the stairs, slow, deliberate, echoing upward. The air filled with the smell of salt and rot, like a beach after a storm. I backed away, gripping the shard so tight it cut my palm. The footsteps reached the landing below the lantern room. I could see its shadow through the gaps in the floor. A shape too large to be human, shoulders hunched, head nearly grazing the ceiling. I did the only thing I could think of. I climbed onto the maintenance platform beside the lens and held the shard toward it. The glass in the lens responded. Its golden veins pulsed brighter, almost alive. The humming in the air deepened, vibrating through my teeth. The figure stopped climbing. For a moment, everything went still. Then the fog pressed against the windows from all sides at once, hard enough to make the glass bend inward. The tower screamed under the pressure. I could feel it, whatever was out there, pushing. I touched the shard to the lens. The moment it made contact, the light exploded. It wasn't white or gold anymore. It was deep, blinding blue, like sunlight filtered through the bottom of the ocean. It filled every corner of the tower, then burst through the fog like lightning. The scream that followed didn't come from the keeper. It came from everything else. I saw shapes dissolving in the beam, their outlines tearing apart like smoke in wind. The fog boiled away, retreating toward the trees, and the air cleared enough for me to see the ocean far below, glowing faintly in answer. When it was over, I dropped to my knees. The shard in my hand had turned black, cold as stone. The keeper lay motionless, eyes open but empty, his skin gone gray. Outside, the world was still. No fog, no movement, just the faint rhythm of waves breaking far off. I stayed there until dawn, unable to move. The light continued to burn, steady again, now facing both land and sea as if undecided. When I finally stepped outside, the cliffside smelled clean, too clean. The gulls were gone, even the air seemed scrubbed of life. At the base of the lighthouse, where the fog had pressed hardest, there were marks in the ground, impressions like knees and hands, pressed deep into the soil, then dragged back toward the forest. I buried the shard near the road before leaving. I didn't want it with me. When I reached the highway later that morning, I looked in the rearview mirror one last time. The beam was still there, faint through the distance, cutting a straight line inland. And just before the fog swallowed it again, I saw another figure walking toward the tower, tall, deliberate, carrying something that glowed faintly gold. The lighthouse had found its next keeper.